Alright, so I made this Iron Man helmet using real brass, actual metal. Oh, you want to learn how I make one too? Well, stick around and I'll show you how, because I'm not going to follow you around. Alright, so before we continue, we got to go back in time. And here we have the raw print helmet again. So first things first, I'm going to take this whole thing apart and I'm going to hit everything with 150 grit sandpaper. Then once I've covered the whole thing with 150 grit, I'm going to move up to 220, then I'll move up to 320. And simultaneously, while I'm sanding, I'll be covering this top portion with wood filler as well as spot putty, and I'll be covering the whole thing with spot putty along the way to basically give me some assistance. Then once I've finished with the grits, I'll hit the whole thing with filler primer, and then once that dries, I'll be hitting the whole thing with 2000 grit sandpaper. And I may do those last two steps one more time just so I can guarantee an extremely smooth surface. So with that out of the way, let's get to work. Alright, so the helmet is all smoothed out and ready for the next step. Alright, so obviously we need to paint the helmet. I used Toyota Mika 3J2 and Alclad chrome for the silver parts. And make sure to have a gloss black base coat for the chrome parts. And then to seal them off, this time I actually used a clear glamour clear coat for the red and Alclad lacquer for the chrome. Obviously, I'll be linking everything I use in the description. Now for the next half of the project, I'm actually going to be doing this process for the first time. So I'm going to be explaining everything in real time because that's just going to be easier for me. Now, obviously, the faceplate and the lip need to be as smooth as possible. And that's because the final result is going to pick up even the slightest of imperfections. So for this next step, I'm going to be sealing off the edges of the faceplate with cardstock paper. And that'll be used as a platform for the silicon. And for the silicon, I'm going to be using Rebound 25. I feel like that's basically the go-to for this kind of project. So I mixed an equal ratio of parts A and B for about 3 minutes, and then I applied the first thin coat with a brush. And this is the detail coat, and this ensures that the silicon goes into every single crevice to catch all the details. And once that first coat is laid down, you need to weigh a bit and sort of check on the silicon to see how it feels. And once the silicon doesn't come off on your glove to the touch, and it also doesn't feel dry, that's when you start the second coat. Now you need to keep a close eye on the silicon because that actually happens fairly quickly. Just periodically come back and touch it, see how it feels. So on the second coat, you do the same thing, but this time you actually apply a much thicker coat, and this is going to be the beginning of the bulk of the silicon. Now, I'll admit, I forgot to make silicon keys like an idiot because you obviously need those for a cast, but I used the idea of someone on YouTube called Blaster Pro, and instead of having silicon keys, he actually used magnets as keys. So obviously, I'll provide a link to his video in the description. However, Blaster Pro actually used this method for a full helmet, and I don't recommend using magnet keys for this application because we're only doing a faceplate. And from my experience, it's really easy to misalign the whole cast when you're putting it back together. So honestly, I recommend silicon keys, so make sure to make those a day in advance. So after applying the keys, I did the same thing as the second coat to the third and fourth coat, and I just let it sit overnight. That'll give it enough time to cure. Now, before we move on, I just want to make a disclaimer. Everything we'll be working with from here on is out for blood. Yours, that is. So I implore you to wear a respirator and gloves because this stuff is no joke. Now granted, you do need to wear this stuff even when you're spray painting, but this stuff is super dangerous. So I feel a need to emphasize this point here. And I'm not trying to discourage you from this project because this project is definitely worth it, but just wear gloves and a respirator and you'll be fine. So for this next step, we're going to fiberglass the exterior of the silicon. So I used fiberglass and fiberglass resin, both Bondo, and I applied about 4 layers of this stuff using a paper mache technique, where I paint a coating of resin on the initial surface, apply a piece of fiberglass, and then I paint another coating of resin over the fiberglass cloth. However, in between the second and third layer was where I put the second set of corresponding magnets. And then again, I let that sit overnight. Now, when taking the cast apart, I recommend cleaning up the fiberglass shell because it does get pretty sharp in some rough areas. I didn't do it because I was a bit in a hurry, but I do recommend cleaning it up, so do what you must. Now, that being said, sprinkle in some salt and pepper.
Man, come on now, get that pep off there.
I'm just kidding, it's brass powder. This stuff. So with the cast reassembled, go ahead and coat the inside with some brass powder. Don't use too much because a little bit does go a long way. This is just a thin layer on top of the resin. Then just sort of tumble it around and dump the excess on a piece of paper so you can put it back in the container and reuse it. Because I hate to admit it, but this stuff isn't cheap. Now for this next step, I used Smoothcast Onyx Slow. I got the slow version because it does give you the most amount of working time possible, and as a beginner I feel that I need that. It doesn't actually give you that much time. So like the silicone, I mixed an equal amount of parts A and B. I'm pretty sure you can mix it for a little longer, but the max amount of time I had was like 1 minute. Maybe because it was a hot day, I don't know. So after mixing it, I poured it in an unimportant area like the eye, because the initial impact does pull the powder. So there's a chance the impact area might have like a dark spot. And then from there, once you pour it all in, you just keep the cast moving until the resin sets. And then once it sets, you can start mixing up the next layer. I did the same thing for about 4 more layers, so I did a total of 5, and that was just me being on the safe side. And then again, I let it sit overnight. And once that was done curing, I pulled it out of the cast and I used the Dremel to just cut it out and clean up the parts. Now, I did start taping first thing before I started polishing. However, I don't recommend doing that just to make your life easier. Just tape it after you're done polishing. So for the first half of the polishing, I used a quadruple lot steel wool and did about 4 passes of that. And then on the second half of the polishing phase, I used Mother's Mag aluminum polish and did about 4 passes of that as well. And with that, you should get a really nice mirror shine. But wait, we're almost done. At this point, now you can start taping off areas, which would be like the separations marked by the grooves. At this point, we're going to try and get the signature brushed metal look that you see in all the films. So I got this Scotch-Brite pad. There's nothing particularly specific about it. I just picked this up from like the local supermarket. So I took the Scotch-Brite pad and I started brushing in the same exact direction multiple times to try and get those scratches in. And with every part, I brushed in a slightly different direction so I can get variation between these parts. And that would simulate them being completely different parts being placed together. And from there, I just welded all the plastic parts together as well as hot glued the resin parts. And I'm doing that because I just want this to be a static helmet. Now, for the light assembly, I'm planning on having this as simply a display piece. So I'm completely covering the eyes with 2 layers of milk jug plastic and hooking the eyes up to wall plug LEDs. I can still put the helmet on, but at the cost of vision. I mean, at least I won't need to bear witness to the horrors of this. If you want, you could just use cosplay LED eyes instead if you wish. And yep, this looks good. Alright, so helmet's done. Obviously, it's not 100% perfect. I did do this for the very first time, so there's a bunch of rough spots here and there. They're not too bad, but definitely places I can learn something. The helmet still could have been smoother in some areas. There's a weird lump in the left eyebrow. I'm not sure where it's from. The cast looks 100% fine, so I have no idea where that came from. And then we got a couple bubbles here and there, especially in the mouthpiece. So definitely room to improve my rotor casting technique. But overall, I am very happy with this helmet. Now, if I just set it down like this, it looks great, but it could definitely use a helmet stand. So if you guys want to check out how I made a helmet stand for this guy for free, then go ahead and check out this video right here when it comes out. But yeah, other than that, I'm tired. I'm gonna go to bed now. Good night.